I will share my screen, Ken's is saying. Hello, my name is Kenz. This is my sign name. I work for Seago Lily. So I'm the outreach program coordinator. I've been with them for about 3 years now. So I started as an advocate for Northern Utah, and then I've made my way to program coordinator, which I've loved. And, as an advocate, as a program coordinator, I have just loved my time there. So my goal today is to educate you all on how to work with deaf victims and survivors. Okay, so I will go ahead and start with my PowerPoint. I'm going to have 2 different PowerPoints. One is just very, very simple, basic training on, advocacy training on how to interact. And the second PowerPoint is more of related to the law enforcement and dealing with deaf and hard of hearing people. So let me go ahead and share my screen now. Oh, and then if you have any questions, any thoughts that pop up, please interrupt me anytime. I'm happy to have that discussion. Thank you. Okay, perfect. Let me see here. All right, let's get started. Sorry, one moment. I just need to make sure I can see my interpreter on my screen. Okay, there we go. Okay, introduction to Seago Lily. So Anna Santana and I are victim advocates, and she's the program supervisor. She's not feeling well, so unfortunately she had to step out for today. So I am just taking over the whole presentation. So please be patient with me. Okay, so Seago Lily was first started in 2001. And so there's a sister organization in Washington State. It's WASS, I believe. WDAS in Washington State. And so she, she's the one who started our foundation and started our organization in Seago Lily for abused deaf and hard of hearing women. So this was our first logo. And then 10 years later, we had a new logo. And then as you can see, the middle one there in 2011, a redesign. And then just recently, this past October, we had in 2022, 2 years ago, excuse me, we had a new redesign. So this is our current design, which I love. It fits, our mission, our colors, match domestic violence and survivor colors. So that's why we made that transition. Okay, so I am just curious if any of you here, if you feel comfortable either talking or you can add it to the chat box, raise your hand, anything that you want to do. But have you ever met a deaf person before? What was that? Well, you've met me now, but if yes, then think about that experience. What was that like? What was unique about that experience? Did you notice anything that worked, as you were approaching a deaf person, or maybe something that didn't work? Did you figure out why it worked? And did you learn during that interaction with a deaf person, did you learn anything? Did you learn anything interesting? Yes, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. So I'm going to go ahead and actually move on with the presentation because it's a little bit of a challenge on Zoom. But if someone raised their hand, or we have a few things in the chat, someone said, yes, I have an ASL degree from Weber State. And I think I've been spoiled as I've been around them since elementary school. Okay, so you've experienced a lot of interactions with deaf people. That's great. Well, that's fun. In elementary school age, that's awesome. That's great. Thank you for sharing. Okay, I'm just going to let you go ahead and read this comic strip really quick. So the dad who is the author of this is deaf himself. So he, does some funny things and by putting these into comic strips. We oftentimes will meet hearing people, and one of the first things let me explain this. So there is a game, and so one guy will give like a ticket to get into the game, right? He has to have a ticket. So he's speaking, and then, I said, "Oh, I am deaf." And immediately that person gets so scared, they freak out. And so we often, unfortunately, have this experience because we're not here to bite you. We're not scary. It's all just communication. Okay. And here's our mission statement and services. Our mission of Seagull Lily Center for the Abuse and Deaf is to promote a safe and empowered community for deaf, hard of hearing, and deafblind people by providing culturally accessible services, advocacy, and education. So we have 3 different areas. So maybe you've seen our logo, you saw the flower of the Seagull Lily. It has 3 different petals or leaves. So the reason behind that is that we have 3 different areas of service. We have direct services, we have training, and we have community education. And I'll expand more upon these 3 areas. So our direct services that we offer, we have advocacy and victim services. We provide case management, financial assistance, counseling, and we currently do have 2 therapists on staff. One is in northern Utah, takes care of the northern area, and one's more of a southern area. One is deaf and one is hearing, but the hearing person does know sign language, so they can communicate with sign language, and their husband is deaf. And then we have shelter companionship, and where we contact shelters and we partner with them to explain more about deaf people, and I'll talk about that later. And then also ADA support, where we teach ADA rights to different services. Okay, we also have training. So we provide shelter training on accessibility services. So like if I go in, sometimes I'll go in to teach how to partner with deaf victims, or what kind of equipment might be needed for their room. Like, for example, if someone knocks on their door and they can't hear that knock, we need to add a doorbell, which will flash the lights on and off, letting them know that someone's at the door. Sometimes if they have a longer stay, as we have some people, they struggle with getting access to different things. Like, for example, this morning, before we went with the presentation, I had said I need an interpreter. And, if I just went ahead with my presentation, then you wouldn't understand what was going on. So sometimes we, need to add a little extra extended time. There might be extra steps because of those services or interpreting services that we require. We train law enforcement. We train interpreters. We do trauma-informed interpreting. Sometimes interpreters do a great job, but they might not really understand trauma. So we have to go into interpreters and kind of explain that. If we have a victim and an interpreter shows up with a smile and they're saying, "Hey, how are you doing?" They're all happy. And that victim, has really had a terrible experience. They've just experienced domestic violence, that sort of thing. So we have to let them know when they come into a room to have appropriate behavior, to have appropriate facial expressions and the vibe that fits with the victim and provides them support. Also, we train lawyers and judges, really any profession we can go in and provide training for. Okay, we also really have been emphasizing our community education, preventative education and empowerment of deaf, hard of hearing, deaf, blind, and latent deafened communities about abuse, violence, and oppression. Because a lot of deaf people have grown up in hearing families that maybe they've had no exposure to sign language or very little exposure. They've been isolated. They've never had really clear communication. So a lot of them don't understand until we educate them about what these things are. You know, sometimes we have to actually educate them, and then they finally realize that they themselves are being abused or have been abused by someone that they love, not because on purpose, but because they just didn't know any better and that they might be doing that to someone else. So really education is very important to us. And also we run support groups. We have LGBTQ support groups that we have. We have different workshops. I think we have a workshop coming up for elderly abuse, abuse of the elderly. We have different events, we have classes, peer support, and more. So really, you know, anytime, we provide any type of education for students as well. Okay, so, you know, we have a couple of minutes, but you might be wondering, what does deaf abuse look like? Let's go ahead and take a few minutes. You guys can just throw out some ideas. Do you have any ideas of what this could be? Any brainstorm ideas? You can add them to the chat. I'll just wait for a couple minutes if you want to add some ideas to the chat. And also, if you don't want to chat, if you're on your phone, go ahead and unmute yourself and you can talk. Okay, I'll move on here. Oh, we have someone. Limiting a person's access to medical needs. Yes, that's a good one. That's a really good one. Yes, taking away, you know, medical needs can look very different for everybody. It could be hearing aids. Oh, purposefully isolating someone. Yes, that is a really big one. Yeah. Okay, any others you can think of right now? Move on. So abuse tends to target areas of the body. Oh, I'm reading another one. Hiding a person's hearing aid until they comply. Yes, yes, definitely. That's control. Yes. Yes. So abuse tends to target areas of the body, not using ASL or other communications. Nicoletta, yes. Thank you. But you know, that are very valuable to the deaf community. Like, for example, attacking the eyes. So as deaf people or deaf blind people, some are still able to see with limited sight. And so, you know, sometimes people will try to destroy what vision they have. You know, deaf people really, really value our eyes because we are visual communicators. And so we, you know, because we don't have hearing, we use our eyes. Again, cochlear implants, hearing aids, anything that, you know, damages or destroys those. And then people who, you know, don't sign, or, you know, people who use their voice, not allowing them to do that. Holding or damaging hands, because that's a way of communicating and gesturing to prevent them from writing. Destroying or, you know, withholding any devices. Anything that's for communication. And we also use a video phone, which is called a VP. So that way, you know, it could be on a laptop, it could be on your TV, because there's a camera that you can attach to your TV. Some people can break those so that it limits your communication. I just wanted to add, I just learned that equipment is part of the FDA. So that is actually a huge issue, because that's something that needs to be recorded and reported if that happens. Refusal to sign. in a signing environment. So for example, you know, my partner, if we go out to eat or whatever, and then if they refuse to sign and they're speaking to me and I don't understand what's going on, you know, it's really important. Or if they're withholding important information that's going on around me and not letting me know. Isolation, you know, not allowing them to socialize with other deaf people, or for the deaf community, that's huge. Our community is so important to us and so valuable to us. And so, you know, if you're already in a, you know, hearing family, maybe you already have a deaf partner, that can be very, very isolating. And then once you become part of the deaf community and you're around those people, that's kind of our world. And so if you take that away, that can be very isolating and damaging as well. Preventing them from getting hearing aids or access to anything that could improve their accessibility. And purposefully, you know, preventing them or criticizing them, whether, you know, of their sign language abilities, or maybe embarrassing them because of their speech, and they can become more isolated and less confident in themselves. Okay, statistics study indicates abuse is 2 to 6 times more likely to occur among people with disabilities. So 30% of hearing persons would be 60% of deaf persons. So that's, you know, big difference between the two categories. And mostly it's because of deaf or disabled people. They do not have access to, you know, certain resources or protection. Okay, deaf culture. We're going to switch interpreters. Thank you. Just so you know, Andy, I'm able to use my voice now. I was able to unmute. I can unmute,
Okay.
but oh,
Got it.
Oh, there we go. Yeah. I was like, yeah, okay. I'm glad it's working. Sorry. I don't know why it was.
Awesome. Okay. So in deaf culture, we really, again, we're really into communication and socialization. Sorry, my cat's getting in the way. Community events. We value our organization and we partner with each other to support each other in every situation we can. We get together as often as we can. We have history and stories that we share with each other. We are very proud of our history, and we've grown so much, built so much structure over the years that we want that structure to continue. So we need to continue to share that so that other people understand how important those are to us. There are some norms for us, again, for deaf people. Our eyes are very important. Eye contact is very important. We can see the person's body language. We can see who they are while we are communicating with them, as well as what their body is doing. If there's any miscommunication, we try to use ASL as much as possible, but again, ASL is not a global language. So it is an American Sign Language. Each country has their own language, and there is a type of universal sign language, but it's more gesture based to try and communicate with people in other cultures who are deaf. Again, the deaf community is a very small community. We are close-knit and we support each other as much as possible. We know pretty much everybody in the community because it's like a small town. Again, sorry with the cat. But yeah, we cherish our community. I want to give you some definitions. Now, the word deaf with a capital D, that emphasizes that this person has a knowledge of deaf culture, identifies as a deaf person. Often they will come from a deaf family, or they have strong ties with the deaf community as far as history goes. We also have deaf with a small d. That typically is also called a deaf person, but usually they're not as involved in the deaf culture or in the deaf community. There's also hard of hearing, which is an individual who has a hearing loss. And typically a person who identifies themselves as hard of hearing, they have a hearing loss. They might also use the term hearing impaired as more of a technical term. It's usually referring to a medical view of their deafness, not really a cultural view. And a lot of people really don't like being referred to as hearing impaired, because like you think of when somebody's driving impaired, that means they're drunk driving, there's something wrong with them. A hard of hearing person or a deaf person, to refer to them as impaired is not accurate, because they still have the ability to do pretty much everything you can except hear. Deaf gain. Now, I always look at that term as something a deaf person can do. I live with 2 deaf roommates, and we love music. We freely have music. I'll sing. I'm not the best singer, but I will freely sing. And my 2 roommates, when they look at me, they just kind of dismiss what I'm doing, because again, I'm a loud singer, but it doesn't really bother them because they're all so deaf. I can sleep peacefully as a deaf person because noise doesn't bother me. So these are benefits of being deaf. This is another comic strip for you to look at. Okay, now, again, we as deaf people, we communicate. When we're communicating with you, try to communicate as normally as possible. Some people, if we need you to speak a little louder, we'll let you know. But generally, when you meet with a deaf person, especially if you meet with a profoundly deaf person, yelling at them is not going to help. Gestures would be a lot more beneficial. I have a story about that.
Playing pickleball.
So I was playing pickleball, and I had an opponent that came up to me. My interpreter was not there yet. My opponent came up and started speaking to you or speaking to me, excuse me. And I told them I was deaf. They started screaming at me, and I'm like, I still don't hear you. They started screaming louder. And again, I tried to tell them, but they didn't understand. So I texted to them, and they were so embarrassed, because it's like, if you scream to me, I still will not hear you. We can play pickleball, and I don't need my ears for that. But you try to communicate with me, that's just screaming at me is not going to help. I can do everything, including playing pickleball, without my ears. Oftentimes a deaf person will come up to a hearing person, and the first thing the hearing person says is, "Can you read lips?" My perspective on that, I know people think that because we're deaf, we naturally read lips. But reading lips is a challenge. it's exhausting. And it's not conducive to understanding each other because you're not going to recognize every single word. If there's somebody in the room with you, especially like if we go to a restaurant like Olive Garden and you see several people talking and somebody says, I love you, or olive juice, I love you. These words on this page all look the same on the lips. Here's another list of homophones, things that sound the same or look the same. Bare as in the animal or bare as in naked. Those look the same and sound the same. Bill or build. These look the same. And those words can easily be confused. So when you're communicating with a deaf person, how do you get their attention? You can flash the lights, you can tap their shoulder gently, you can wave your hand. Please do not throw anything at them unless you absolutely have to throw something. Do it with something soft because you don't want to injure them. Now, communicating with a deaf person, there shouldn't be any visual noise. For example, people walking around, walking between, or things in the background happening that can be distracting. That becomes visually exhausting for a person who relies on their eyes. So make sure when you're communicating with a deaf person, try to keep the area as visually quiet as possible. Keep the deaf person in the loop. For example, the interpreter hasn't shown up. Okay, that's something that maybe the deaf person needs to know. Like if you are walking along the street and you hear a car honking, you can tell the deaf person through gestures there's a car honking. If somebody sneezes, we typically will say, God bless you. And that's something that you can tell the deaf person, or somebody just sneezed very loud. When the interpreter is there, make sure you talk to the deaf person and not to the interpreter. The interpreter is just there to facilitate the communication. We want to be able, as deaf people, to be able to talk directly to the person as much as possible. So the interpreter will stand close to the hearing person so that the deaf person can see both the person speaking and the person signing. Now, not all deaf people have the same accessibility needs. When you meet a deaf person, it's important to empower them to advocate for themselves for accessibility. For example, do you need an interpreter? Do you need a CDI? And I will explain more about what a CDI is later. We do have some clients who do not know what kinds of accessibility options they have or even what they would need. Some of them don't know that there are other options than what they are already aware of. So we can provide that information to them. Now, a CODA means a child of deaf adults. Most likely that child will know sign, but you can see there is a difference in how language is passed through the child as well as through the adult. For example, if a family speaking Spanish immigrates from another country, they sometimes expect the child to be able to interpret for the Spanish speaking adult. And do you think that's really appropriate? It's not fair for the child to be communicating a doctor's appointment or that technical language to their parents and to the doctor. I don't recommend using the deaf person's partner, especially in an abuse situation. We need to make sure that that deaf person is alone one-on-one with the person interviewing them so that they can get as much open information as possible. This is kind of a funny comic illustrating that. I mentioned earlier about the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act. Protects individuals with disabilities from discrimination and ensures equal opportunities to benefit from programs, services, and activities. Now, this law was passed in 1950. It was about, or a lot of years ago, but 45 years ago. (1990), excuse me. So that was only 34 years ago. Now someone's asking a question in the chat. Do you ever run into a situation where you need a foreign sign language interpreter, and how do you overcome that? Now, I don't speak Spanish, is what the person is saying. That's a very good question. That does create an additional challenge. There is a big group of Venezuelan deaf here, and it does become a challenge for us to try and find somebody who knows Spanish, specifically a deaf person, a CDI, who knows both Venezuelan Spanish and American Sign Language, so we can try to communicate between them. Often we'll have 2 or 3 different interpreters in the room trying to pass the language down so that we can get communication between English and the Spanish-speaking person. Does that answer your question? It does require a lot of patience when working with multiple interpreters as well as when you're working with somebody who speaks a foreign language. So again, the ADA was passed roughly 34 years ago. There's still a lot of improvement to come. There has been a lot of improvement so far, but we still have a long way to go. Some of the things that ADA helps with is allowing service animals to come into a facility. Now, legally, you cannot ask the person what the service animal is for. Now, let me clarify that. You can't ask what the service animal is doing for the person with a disability. Like, do you have diabetes, or do you have seizures, or do you have medical needs, for example? If the dog or whatever kind of service animal does not perform its duties properly, then you have a right to say, I'm sorry, you're not allowed to bring that animal in, or you need to take that animal out. Providing ASL interpreters is a big thing that ADA allows. When you set a doctor's appointment for a person who maybe does not have proficiency in English, paperwork written in English may not be clearly understood. Direct communication through a regular interpreter may not be as clear, so providing a CDI would be beneficial. Again, if a person has further disabilities rather than just deafness, for example, if they're deaf-blind, then a CDI would be beneficial in those types of situations as well. We can provide shelter to a person for up to 90 days if needed. Or shelter does provide a certain amount of time for a person to stay. We can provide an extension on that amount of time because of their disability. We can also accommodate requests for room changes through ADA provisions. I mentioned not using the child of the deaf adult or partner or friend to interpret for them. Again, if the information is confusing or complicated, it can become frustrating for all those involved. It's preferred to get a certified interpreter for that situation, especially for something important like a court situation. They have special certifications and trainings that the interpreters can take. We want to make sure that the interpreter has the skills and ability necessary for that situation. I know law enforcement, they teach their officers a basic amount of sign language just for, again, rudimentary communication. But if they're doing an investigation or something more in depth, they will need to provide an interpreter for that situation. If it's just a basic conversation without any strong implications, then they can just use whatever communication they can find for that moment until they can get an interpreter. Let me see if this video is going to work. Can you see it?
Ready to switch, Sarah?
Yeah.
Perfect. All right. You see my screen again. Okay, so like I mentioned earlier, sign language is not universal. It's very diverse. It's very beautiful, you know, same as American Sign Language and the speaking languages. Like I love Australian Sign Language. I love that. So yeah, I don't know why. It just makes more sense to me, but I love all these different representations of sign language. Okay, understanding the role of certified interpreters. So, you know, maybe we get in a client and their information is obviously very, very private. It's important to keep everything confidential. Well, interpreters, they are required to keep everything confidential as well. So they, you know, there's a HIPAA law, kind of the same as ethics, same idea that interpreters have to follow the Code of Professional Conduct. So communication is a two-way street. They are there to facilitate information. They do have to pass a national standardized test. They have a code of ethics similar to HIPAA. Everything that's mentioned in appointments has to stay private. So also there's like surrounding information. So the interpreters are required to let you know if someone next door is screaming or something's happening over there, they heard a loud bang, interpreters are required to pass on that information as well to keep deaf people in the loop and letting them know what's going on. Like the interpreter is required to let me know things that are accurate and clear and to give me that information. And sometimes you might struggle with an interpreter. A deaf person may not like the interpreter, feel that they're not the right person. They are allowed to ask for a different interpreter and find someone who accommodates their needs in a better way. Okay, so when working with a deaf client and interpreter, here are some things you should know. Make sure the interpreter is standing next to the hearing person. It's best if we could have that, but sometimes we have situations where the deaf prefer the interpreter to move. It depends on how many people are in the room. Make sure that there's good lighting so that the interpreter is visible. Like we mentioned before, address the deaf person directly and speak normal. Speak at a normal pace. For example, this morning, my interpreter was signing normally, and then the person was talking to me. The hearing person would stop. They would say two sentences and stop and stop. And finally, the interpreter said, "You can just speak normally, and I'll let you know if you're going too fast. You know, you could speak at a normal pace, just like you're talking to a hearing person." And if the interpreter feels that the information is coming too fast or they're not understanding, then the interpreter will take control and say, "Excuse me, would you mind backing up a little? Or can you clarify this point that you made?" And they'll facilitate that information. And allow time for questions. Check in every so often to make sure the information is clear, that the deaf person is understanding, that everyone's on the same page. And if not, then try to rephrase your question or your comment. Okay, so I've been saying CDI, CDI. So I want to clarify, what is a CDI? It is a certified deaf interpreter. So what is that? It is a deaf or hard of hearing person who translates from ASL to more of the client's need or the client's level of language for their understanding. So one of my PowerPoints, the next one, will show the difference between English and ASL. So you'll be able to see that a little bit more clearly. If there's some ASL phrases, and a CDI would be able to break this down for a deaf person and give it to them in a way that they could understand. So a CDI, needs to have knowledge of the deaf community, the deaf culture, and how to facilitate and rephrase information for deaf people. Most CDIs are deaf themselves, and they're native ASL users. They're as close to native as possible. So remember, like I had said, that interpreter, the hearing interpreter, they need to be sitting or standing next to the hearing person. But now if we have a CDI involved, it becomes a little bit different. So the victim may be sitting here, and then the hearing interpreter would actually sitting next to them or behind them, behind the victim. And then the officer or whoever's doing the interviewing would be sitting next to the CDI. And the reason is because the victim is watching the CDI. The CDI is watching the hearing interpreter, hearing person. And the victim doesn't need to see the hearing interpreter at this point because they are looking at the CDI. So the hearing interpreter is getting the information from the interviewer or the law enforcement, giving that to the CDI, then the CDI is translating to the victim. So it can be a little bit confusing, but hopefully this sort of can help you clarify that. So our agency in Seagull Lily, we work with, there are other agencies out there, but we work with, and you can find them online, but these are the top 3 in Utah that Seagull Lily uses. So 5 Star, Interwest, and ASL Communications are the top 3 here in Utah. So Kelsey, we are from, yes, I'm from 5 Star. So for example, these 2 interpreters are from 5 Star. A lot of times interpreters will work for more than one agency. Like sometimes they work for Interwest, and also they work for 5 Star. So it just depends. And a lot of times, like I mentioned, if there's a client who prefers a specific interpreter, they can request that. And also the reason is the interpreter needs to know who they're interpreting for to make sure that there's no conflict of interest. Maybe the client will say, this is the interpreter I want, and then most likely there will be another agency, but it's nice if the client says, I prefer 5 Star because I prefer this person, but maybe you have a contract with another person, but it's possible that Kelsey or another interpreter works for both of them. So another reason to share that information of what the client is and what they're interpreting for is to make sure that they pick the right interpreter to work with what the need is and what the situation is, and they can provide the best interpretation. Again, if there's a conflict of interest, you know, it may be that the interpreter doesn't want to work with that deaf person, or maybe they're related somehow, or it would probably be best to separate them and find a different interpreter for that reason. Okay, like I mentioned earlier, you'll have to do like your name, the name of the agency department, a contact person, and a phone number, and you'll just give the agency that information. And also the name of the deaf person, and the interpreting time and date and duration of the appointment. And then tell the interpreters when they arrive. Sorry about that. For example, if you're meeting at the hospital, then they need to have a person of contact, or which room number, or what the best way is to find them. Because sometimes the location can change or can be very complicated. So the more details you can provide, then the better efficiency the interpreter can show up and be able to find the deaf person and not be searching all around. We can get the communication started as fast as possible. And that's why, with the interpreters, the purpose, you can tell them what the purpose is. Maybe it's just very basic. You don't need to tell them all the details, but let them know this is a person who's been a victim of sexual assault, and we're going to be interviewing them. That's all you need to say. Okay, I'm going to move on, but here's the ABCs. In case we want to finger spell, I would, encourage everyone to learn some basic signs. You never know when you're going to meet a deaf person, and you can say, hello, this is my name, or do you need help? Some of those basic signs. I don't expect you all to know ASL, but if you want to, there's, some resources online. One of my favorite quotes, I love this quote. So people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel, positively or negatively. So I remember one time, it was during COVID, it was I was having a rough day, and I went to Jamba Juice. I was texting my order, to give to the person. And then someone came up to me, and it was so strange because I didn't sign or anything. That person just signed, "Are you deaf?" And I was like, oh, I was kind of taken aback. Like, how did you know? So, we were texting back and forth, and it was just so much easier. Instead of using my phone, that person at Jamba Juice, I could just order. So then I would go again and again. I would see that same person. And so it was just nice to have someone there to immediately give me, access. That way I could order my food quickly. And it was just such a nice experience. Okay, so contact information for our services and advocates are here. My boss, Erin, Anna, and then we have therapists. I have another PowerPoint here with some of our therapist information. Here are 2 therapists who sign. And before I jump to my next PowerPoint, I want to pause and ask for any questions or anything I can answer before I move on. Oh, yeah, let me go back to the contact information. Okay, social workers will often contact us. Oh, so the question is, how do you get your referrals? Is it straight from the hospital usually? It varies. Sometimes we get referrals from police officers, sometimes advocates, sometimes advocate within the police, domestic violence advocates. Sometimes shelters will reach out to us, and sometimes the hospitals, their social workers will contact us. So. I just let Ken's know the screen is small. They'll make it big again. There we go. So like I said, I will post, the second PowerPoint also has our contact information as well, so that'll come back up again. it's not on here, but if you need any help and you want, direct access, we do have an email, help@seagulllily.org. And you can always contact us there as well. So Luba is our deaf therapist. And Kathleen is our hearing therapist. But again, she's amazing. She used to be an interpreter. She has a deaf husband. She's very, very involved in the deaf community and is a great ally and a great therapist as well. They're both wonderful therapists. Yes, to answer your question, the question is, do you work with victims of human trafficking, labor of sexual trafficking? Yes, we do. We do. We've had just 2 last year, and we did work, let's see, 2 years ago. 2 years ago, we had somebody. So yes, yep, we help any type of victim in any type of situation. Okay, well, again, feel free to throw out a question. If something pops up, you can use your voice, you can get on the microphone or chat. I'm happy to answer. If you want me to back up or clarify anything, let me know. Okay, communication between law enforcement and deaf, blind, or hard of hearing community. Here's our content. Okay, so this is a deaf survivor story. So deaf and hearing domestic violence situation. So the deaf person, the deaf person had been abused and was called 911. So the police officer shows up to the home. There's one hearing person and one deaf person. Most likely, who do you think the law enforcement officer will talk to? The hearing person, right? They will chat with the hearing person, see what's going on. And that's, the first story of the situation. Obviously, the hearing person's probably going to blame the deaf person if they're in a domestic violence dispute. And then only later on, they find out that the deaf person was the victim the whole time. And then they have to reevaluate, the whole situation from the beginning. They can't revisit when the police officer first arrived on the scene, right? But they have to start kind of a new amendment of the report, because what seemed like the person who was the victim is actually not the victim. So, but then that's an amendment that's not always looked at. And then the deaf person who is the victim doesn't appear to be a victim at the beginning of the story. So it's just, the situation and their roles in this situation became very confusing. Here's a clip. We'll just watch this. Okay. So I'm just curious, do you guys see the red flags there, right? How many red flags? Many, many, especially at the end. It's, yeah, of course. But again, so deaf people are more likely to stay because of feeling like they are deaf, they already struggle maybe with the outside world, they already have some isolation. So it's a lot easier to stay in a lot of situations. And also the exposure of the child to see that interaction between parents, you know, and then the child thinks that that's okay and that's normal, and that becomes, you know, very normal. And then as they become older, that same situation may play out again, and they don't realize what's appropriate and not appropriate. So some of the things that I wanted to mention on the first PowerPoint, we may skip through a little bit on the second PowerPoint. So deaf culture and language, we talked about values, norms, community, and language. We've already talked about abuse that is common within the deaf community. We talked about, you know, damaging eyesight or ears, attacking or holding hands to prevent signing, destroying, withholding, or damaging communication devices, refusing to sign in an environment that's necessary, preventing them, the person from associating with deaf community or getting resources that they can access. And then also criticizing speech, hearing, and signing abilities.
Now, understanding deaf behavior, it's really easy to have misunderstandings. When a person is expressing excitement with around a police officer, a deaf person is going to sign more energetically, more excitedly, and the police officer typically will look at that excited movement and think that there's something different going on. They'll tend to interrupt a lot, especially if they're not understanding what's going on. They want to make sure they're getting the right information. So there'll be a lot of interruptions and having to go back and re-clarify what was said. Their signing could appear to be blunt or rude. For example, if they're using a hand shape like this, it actually means like a person who's big or large or fat, and that can seem to be blunt or impolite when they're actually just showing how the person was walking. Sometimes they might ignore verbal commands because they don't understand, or maybe they're misunderstanding what they're being told. Again, the police officer may think that they're doing suspicious movements when really that's just their ASL movement trying to communicate through their sign language can appear to be very different. Sometimes deaf people will use their voice, but again, not all deaf people do. Sometimes they will vocalize while they're signing, and that can sound very loud, especially if the person has some hearing left. If they're hard of hearing, they might speak very loudly, and that again seems very aggressive to the police officer. If they have any kind of inner ear problem or balance issues that make it hard for them to walk, they won't be able to walk that straight line that the police officer wants them to walk, so they may appear to be impaired in some other way. Again, with their signing, it's easy for them to invade the police officer's personal space, and that can appear aggressive as well. Now, remember I mentioned how working with a CDI happens. Sometimes the things that a deaf person says, they might just mention something. Again, English is their second language, so there's not really a direct translation. if they're saying something like this, me hide, see, daddy beat me, scared, run, house, farm, man, call police, come, question, really shock. If we were to translate exactly what they were signing, this is what it would look like. So what does it actually mean? If you were to write down word for word the signs they're using, it would be confusing like this. So what do you think would be the actual translation into accurate English for this? Any volunteers want to try it? Going once, going twice. Okay. I'm hiding because I saw dad beat me. I'm scared and I ran. Okay, when I first read this, it says, daddy beat me. This is the actual translation. I was hiding and saw daddy hit mommy many, many times. I was so scared. I ran to a house down the road. The man there called the police. They came to me and asked me a lot of questions, but I was really just frozen in shock. So you see a big difference between the two. Like that concept of hit mom, who was being hit, who was doing the hitting. And again, remember the person telling the information probably has some sort of trauma. So it's going to be a shock to them to have just experienced that situation. So telling what happened may be difficult. It is very important to have an interpreter available and a CDI as well. Here's some communication tips. Attention getting, again, you can tap the person on the shoulder. Eye contact is very important. Speaking clearly and at an appropriate moderate pace. Making sure the environment is free of visual noise. Be willing to write on paper. Again, English might not be this deaf person's first language. Talk to the person, not to the interpreter. Now, VRS is a video relay service or virtual relay service. Deaf people typically don't like that in a situation because the video can freeze, it can pixelate, there could be connection issues with the internet. It can be a much more frustrating experience than having an in-person interpreter. So if you have to use VRS, use it for emergency purposes only. You can even let the person know through the phone, just something simple like, we are going to have to take you to the police station. We will have an interpreter there ready for you so that we can get clear communication. That information alone can be enough to help the person calm down enough to come with you. If the phone is ringing or if someone knocks on the door, if you hear something else in the environment, let them know. Body language and facial expressions are important because, again, they're seeing visually what you're trying to communicate. So your body language and facial expressions will let them know if they're in trouble or if they need to be worried about something. Typically, if you can keep a calm demeanor, it will help the person to remain calm as well. And double check to make sure that they understand what the situation. I mentioned already about the ADA law, understanding communication and support services, as well as understanding interpreter roles. Law enforcement agencies must provide communication assistance and services to people who are deaf and hard of hearing, except when a particular aid or service would result in undue burden or fundamental change in the nature of the law enforcement services being provided. So there's a question that popped up in the chat. So I'm mentioned earlier, if you are not certified, we understand that you can use ASL to communicate, but if I'm going to the police station and I ask you to go with me, that's a totally different situation than, but anything related to really heavy or intense communication needs, if you need to make sure that there's absolutely transparent communication, please, a certified interpreter is a much better option. Oh, that is a good question. What's an example of service being an undue burden or change in nature of the law? Let me see if I have any information on that. Maybe hold on to that question and I can comment about that later. If you know basic alphabets or some basic signings, you can use that to communicate through normal communication with a person. But any heavy situations that rely on absolutely clear communication, please make sure there's an interpreter present. Simcomming is not appropriate. Simcomming is when you're talking and signing at the same time. It's not effective communication. Okay. Now that last question, I just sent a message to my boss to see if they can give me some way of answering that. So I'll get back to you. Again, agencies must give primary consideration to providing the aid or service requested by the deaf person or the person with a hearing disability. I mentioned earlier, if you ask or if the victim requires an accommodation, the agencies must give primary consideration to providing that accommodation. When interpreters are needed, agencies must provide interpreters who can interpret effectively, accurately, and impartially. Now, a deaf-blind story. I don't have a story actually, how the organization responded, but there are some do's and don'ts that I can let you know about. Deaf-blind culture, they've started to develop pro-tactile means of communication. You might have seen somebody doing signs on the person's back or on their hand or different parts of their body. For a deaf-blind person, they really need that touch for access to communication. So if you have a problem with touch, then that might be a little bit uncomfortable for you. They also value information sharing as a culture. Deaf-blind abuse looks like not being allowed to use a walking stick, removing or hurting their service animal, just leaving them alone in isolation, not communicating with them. Now, identifying a deaf-blind person, typically some of them have dark or thick glasses. They might have a service animal or an SSP, which is a co-navigator or a sighted person who is guiding them, basically seeing for them in various locations, such as a store or a doctor's appointment, leading them to a location even driving them around. Again, communication tips. Ask them for what their preferred accommodations are. Print on palm is something you can do. You can actually draw letters on their palm. If they want you to speak, then, or if you need to speak, then speak slowly and clearly. You can use a smartphone that can hook up to a device that will actually convert the text to Braille. Some people have a smartphone device that will actually convert speech or text to Braille. In an emergency situation, like a very dangerous situation, you need to get the person out of there very quickly, you can actually draw an X on their back. And that means this is an emergency, we need to get out of here. Understanding deafblind behavior. Protactile is their way of expressing their emotions through touch. I'm trying to remember. There's like tapping on the person's hand is an indication of agreement, or you're following the conversation. If you're rubbing their hand, it can mean no. Now, protactile communication is very cool. I really wish I could take a class on learning how to do that. Again, eye contact is not always possible, depending on the person's vision. They might have their eyes closed. Their eyes might be looking around. You might have to walk with them or guide them, walk slowly because they might have balance issues. There might be stoic or non-responsive facial expressions. You may not be able to tell what they're thinking or how they're feeling based on their facial expressions. They're service animals. If they discipline the guide dog, it's not abuse, it's actually just training. Deafblind person will be constantly reaching out to try and touch things because, again, their access to information around them is through touch. As far as the ADA is concerned, guide dogs and service animals are allowed full communication access through professional and certified ASL interpreter. If they request, you can contact the interpreting agency anytime 24/7 to request an interpreter. Now I'm jumping ahead a little bit. Do you have any questions related to deafblind before I move on? None? The question is, do you have tactile interpreters? Yes, that is a good question. We do have interpreters and CDIs who are going to classes and training, learning how to work with deafblind individuals. Do we have people who know how to work with deafblind individuals? When you request an interpreter, it's important to let them know that tactile is a necessity. And again, requesting that with a CDI, you can just let them know that you need tactile interpretation. That might be a better question for the interpreter. Are interpreters required to learn tactile signing? No, but a lot of us, again, have taken specialized training to learn how. So we do have access to interpreters who do have that knowledge, and usually we can find out who has that knowledge so we can make sure we get the best fit for that person. Again, good question. Thank you so much. Okay, a hard of hearing story. How do you do tactile with your therapists? That's a good question. Wow. I didn't think about that. I've been deaf my whole life, but I've known deaf people and I've worked with them and learned how to work with them, but I would imagine how to do tactile with a therapist. There's two ways that I could think of. You could do typing, again, if they've got a device that translates that to Braille. You can have an interpreter right next to the therapist who is able to do the tactile interpreting. Those would be a couple ways of finding accommodation. Again, great questions. I'll have to do some more research in order to be able to fully answer those. So we did have a client who is hard of hearing, and he was able to speak well. Somebody called the police, and she was describing to the police that she was deaf, but the policeman didn't believe her because she spoke so well. So they charged her, and she had to go to court. She was able to contact Sega Lily, and at that time, my boss was her advocate. She called the prosecutor and said, this person is deaf and we need to support them. The person was so embarrassed that they actually dropped the case. So we're going to switch interpreters real quick.
So yes, so we had to figure out, how to meet with our client. Like I mentioned before, not all deaf people and hard of hearing people are the same, right? We all have different needs. There's so many different behaviors, and one thing does not accommodate everybody. So some deaf people can speak actually very well. Some maybe are hard of hearing and they can speak for themselves really well. And some hard of hearing people grew up, hearing, and then all of a sudden they quickly lost their hearing. So there's just a wide variation of people who can speak and not speak. So some speak well, some may not speak as well. Okay, marginalizing, using their hearing loss against them, not allowing them to use assistive listening devices, or whether that be headphones or going to a quiet room or anything like that. That is abuse. Okay, hearing aids. So I have a hearing aid, as you can see here. And that, I am not, I'm not hearing anymore, but so when I take that off, I am deaf. I do struggle a lot with missing a lot of sound. And so with my hearing aid, this actually does work for me. I really have to pay attention, and it gives me some sound. So some people who are hard of hearing, they don't all use hearing aids. Maybe some can hear a little bit, or they prefer not to use what remaining hearing they have. They may rely on lip reading. Some use both. Some might use some sign language. It just depends. Okay, here's some myths about hard of hearing and hearing aids. That hearing aids can fix hearing loss. That is not true. So we may be able to hear voices, but we can't understand until that person is looking at us and we're putting the sound to their lips. Then that way we can understand maybe what's going on. Some other myths are that we speak so well that people forget that we have a hearing loss. So that's my story. I grew up, using speech and speaking well, but oftentimes I will speak and then I feel like that's kind of a mistake because I will use my voice and then that hearing person forgets that I am deaf. So they walk away or turn their back to me and I have to remind them, hey, I can only understand you when you're looking at me. So that's a very common story about people who, say that they're deaf and then they can speak and then hearing people forget about their hearing loss and rely on that. And then also issues with denial. Sorry about my cat here. All right, hard of hearing behavior. It may take some time for a person who's hard of hearing to process, and it may take a little bit of time to respond. So that means either, they don't understand the question or they need a little bit more time to respond and understand it. So you may ask me something and I may respond in the wrong way. That means that I've missed some of the information or words from that sentence were missing, and so I didn't understand it. Having this facial expression, looking like an angry facial expression, may just be a sign of concentrating or their brain processing. Bluffing, meaning trying to just fill in or guessing on what that person said. I have experienced that and done that myself, and I got caught. And then, there's a funny story. One time, it was back, I was a CNA, certified nursing assistant. And at that time, I was able to say yes. I was, to be honest, I was just going like this and nodding my head because hearing was really hard for me because my blood, if I put my head down, I had even a harder time hearing. So I would go down and then come up and say yes to whatever was being asked of me. So that person, I'm not a religious person, but that person they started praying on my head because I had put my head down when I was a CNA. And they said, I pray that you get your hearing back and you can be the same as a hearing person. And then I realized I said yes, because they asked if they could pray for me. So I never would have said yes if I really understood what they were asking me. But I was in like an awkward situation. And sometimes I don't understand what someone is saying. So it's easier to just nod and say yes. So a lot of people, like hearing people, will tend to say, oh, never mind, never mind. That is very offensive to deaf and hard of hearing people. Because, we are trying to make the effort to communicate with you. So please make the effort back to let us know if I've missed something or don't understand something. Please be willing to rephrase or repeat what you have said to a deaf or hard of hearing person. And when you're tired or under duress or stress, your understanding or ability to understand what somebody is saying becomes very difficult. With my experience and other people who are deaf or hard of hearing, at the end of the day, it can be really difficult for us to take in new information because we've been working at hearing all day long. And so sometimes our brains are just worn out by the end of the day. So please make sure that your client is, feeling well, and what's the word I'm looking for? That they seem to be alert, that they're not worn out, that they're able to continue to have that conversation. Okay, some other communication tips. Getting their attention first before you start talking to them. Same with deaf person. Make sure you get their attention before you start talking. Slow down a little bit and enunciate, practice speaking well and clear. Rephrase rather than just repeat. And be within 6 feet of that person who's hard of hearing and face them. And we won't bite. Like I said before, we're not scary. And try to make sure you're in a quiet environment, quiet area. Sometimes I work with like social media content, and they talk about putting closed caption on videos and things like that. And a lot of the times they ask why, they have music. And so you're talking and then you have music at the same time. So that it can be very, very hard for deaf and hard of hearing people to do that. So the more sound and the more noise just causes more distraction rather than focusing on what's actually being said. So the quieter, the better. Like we've mentioned before, being in a well-lit area, especially for lip reading, and be aware of barriers. Again, ask the person what they need for the best communication. So ADA, write things down, like we mentioned before. You know, English may not be a person's first language. But one thing, when I talk about writing things down, what's the word I'm looking for, is to don't diminish the word, if that, like, almost dumb it down. If you're using a big word that they don't know, then please take the time to explain what that word means or a way to rephrase it. So this helps deaf people learn something new and they can use accurate terms. You know, and it gives you a moment to educate them. Don't just say, oh, never mind. Let me find a word that you will understand. Because, you know, make sure that you're accommodating them and that they can understand what phrasing you're using. And then also sometimes people, that hard of hearing people, will not use sign language. Maybe they use closed caption over the phone. They have a CART, which is live translation. There can be an oral interpreter. So I don't know exactly how oral interpretation works because I've never had an oral interpreter before or heard of that. But I'm assuming that it is a person who, you know, they can lip read and understand well, and then use a sign language interpreter if that accommodates their need. Okay, here's our resources again. I'm going to leave this on the screen for a moment and give you guys a time to screenshot it or write down whatever you need to. I think I need to update this information. So it is help@seagulllily.org. And my favorite quote again. Maybe you'll remember me, like I had talked about my experience going in and finding someone who knew sign language. Okay, here's our contact information again. And our therapists. Are there any questions? I'm going to stop sharing my screen here. I think that is it on my end, but I'm happy to answer any questions or any comments. Let me see if my boss responded back. Oh, you're welcome, Haley. Thank you so much.
Does anyone have any other questions or comments?
We do not have a shelter. Someone just asked, how many people do you house? We are not a shelter. So we collaborate with other shelters in the valley, but hopefully one day, you know, in the future, that would be our goal, is to be able to have a house for the deaf. But we are so small. I mean, it is such a small community. That it's a lot harder for us to develop our own place and our own shelter right now, so we don't. But we do get funds. We do a lot of fundraisers to help deaf victims and families of deaf victims to get temporary shelter and housing. So we prefer to use shelters. Sometimes those are full. And so occasionally we do help them get into hotels as well.
Ken's, could you possibly give a little rundown of all the services that Seagull Lily does offer and the things that y'all could help advocates and service providers with?
Okay. So first, like I mentioned, we are not an interpreting agency. Oftentimes people will contact us and ask if we can provide an interpreter for their deaf client. We don't do that. We provide support. We can do some clarification, some resources, but if a deaf person is already a part of your organization or your agency, we would prefer to do a collaborative effort with your client and your agency. We don't have as much access to the system and things out there as far as law enforcement as much as your organizations and agencies have. So we like to collaborate with you. What else? We provide education. If you need some help with, finances, we do have financial support that we can connect you with. What else? Training, support. I'm trying to think of what else we can help you guys with. Most of the time, we just do a lot of collaboration with advocates just to make sure, that they are getting the best services possible. Oh, and thank you, Anna. We also have direct counseling. We have free counseling. So we provide free therapy for deaf clients. If you have a client who needs therapy, we can collaborate and provide therapy and counseling for them as well.
Does Seagull Lily do trainings for service providers and rape crisis centers if they asked or requested?
Yes. Yep. We do training to talk about, working with one-on-one with a deaf person, different situations, more trauma-informed care, especially with deaf or hard of hearing people. We try to do any types of trainings to make to meet the deaf client where they are. There can be different unique situations, mental health issues, education levels. There's a lot of variation within the deaf community. So we try to minimize those barriers, minimize frustrations and conflicts. So also we can come in as an advocate with you at the same time and the client and try to figure out what type of barriers are there and frustrations that we see and try to help you overcome those.
Okay, I think this is the last question. Can you tell folks maybe the requirements for having Seagull Lily come into their organization for a training? Is there a cost associated? Do they need to provide interpreters? Do you provide interpreters? Kind of that information.
Sure. So if I were to do a training, then I would contact your organization. I would provide the interpreter if I was contacting you. But if you are asking me to come and do a training, then you would be responsible for finding an interpreter. So, and I show up at no cost to your organization. But if you're asking for me to come, then you would provide the interpreter. And Seagull Lily, most of the time we go out to organizations. So if we ask to come in, if we're the ones who initiate it, then we'll bring an interpreter. For example, my grant requires me to meet with different shelters, and I will contact the interpreters. But sometimes there's really small agencies that maybe, they're not on the shelter list or anything like that. Then sometimes we can take care of that. The interpreting costs, it kind of depends on the size of the agency, but the interpreter is a tax write-off, by the way. So keep that in mind as well. And when, so for example, let's see, if you're going to the hospital to see a client and that client is deaf, you can let the hospital know, and the hospital will have to provide an interpreter because that is their patient. What else? What else was I going to say related to this? Oh, so if your organization or agency, or if your client comes to your place and you need an interpreter, then like I said, look at HR, because it's possible that there's already a contract, often such as hospitals, and big organizations, they already have specific contracts with agencies. And then if not, then go ahead and start the process where you can contact an agency online, and find an interpreter that way.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's great information. Does anyone else have any questions? Oh, it looks like we got one in chat.
That's my boss, Erin. So when you're applying for grants, we encourage you to set aside budget contracted fee category for accessibility interpreters. So that way you have the funds to provide interpreters. Yes, thank you for that information, Erin. Any more questions? Well, thank you again for those of you who were patiently waiting for interpreters to show up. I really appreciate you. And I know Andy had already secured interpreters, and it was sort of a last minute. This all just happened very last minute, so kind of mess up our schedule. But I appreciate your guys' patience with us today. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you everyone for attending. Thank you to the interpreters for being here. And I will have this uploaded. Hopefully it will be done today. Sometimes, again, it does take a little bit longer. But I will send the link out to everyone so you can watch it again if you need, or just subscribe to us on YouTube, and you should be able to see all of our past webinars on there as well. So thank you, everyone, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Oh, someone just asked, what is our YouTube? Let me get the link for you. All right, the link to the YouTube is in the chat. You can also search for the Utah Coalition Against Sexual Assault, and it will be on, you'll be able to find us there as well. And we have that little beehive logo. Awesome. Kenz, could you type your email address in the chat so folks can get a hold of you as well?
Yes.
All right, everyone. I hope that you have a great day. I'm going to stay on for a couple more minutes to make sure that folks have time to get that email address and the link to the YouTube page. But yeah, I hope you have a great day and a great rest of your week.
Thank you so much. Have a good day. Thank you, interpreters.